It was my 64th birthday. A warm July morning that smelled faintly of magnolia and rain. I woke early, as I always did, and waited for Daniel to come downstairs. My son had been distant lately, working long hours at the investment firm in Richmond. But I thought maybe today would be different. Maybe he'd remembered the daisies I loved, or that small bakery on Main Street where we used to get chocolate eclairs when he was little. When he finally came down, his wife Tiffany followed right behind him. Perfume thick in the air. Voice too cheerful to be real. She leaned in and kissed my cheek. "Happy birthday, Mom," she said, in that bright tone that made everything sound rehearsed. Daniel smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. He looked at his watch, then at me. "We've got something special planned for you today. You'll love it." I tried to believe him. I put on my best dress, the blue one with tiny flowers, the same one I'd worn to church last Easter. It was a little snug around the waist, but it made me feel like myself again. Tiffany watched me carefully as I adjusted the collar. Then she said, "You don't need to pack anything fancy. Just a sweater and some comfortable shoes." Her smile stayed frozen. As we drove out of the city, I asked where we were going, but Daniel just said, "You'll see." His hands gripped the steering wheel tight. Knuckles white, eyes fixed on the road ahead. Tiffany scrolled through her phone in the back seat, sighing occasionally, as if even being there was a favor. The streets of Richmond gave way to long stretches of farmland, the asphalt turning to gravel, then to dirt. I noticed how the sky grew emptier, the houses farther apart. I tried to make small talk, to fill the silence that pressed against the car like humidity. But my words fell flat. Daniel barely answered. After nearly 2 hours, we turned onto a narrow dirt track that cut through weeds taller than the car. The wheels hit potholes so deep my teeth rattled. I looked around, but there was nothing. Just the skeletons of old barns and fields gone wild. Finally, the car stopped beside what looked like a shack. The roof sagged like it was tired of standing, and the windows were boarded up with uneven planks. The front porch leaned to one side, held together by rusted nails and prayers. Daniel turned off the engine. "Here we are," he said, voice flat, like he'd reached the end of a long errand. I waited for him to say it was a joke. I waited for Tiffany to laugh and tell me the real surprise was dinner somewhere nice. But Daniel got out, opened the trunk, and lifted out my old canvas bag, the one I hadn't used since Paul and I took weekend trips to the lake 20 years ago. He set it on the ground by my feet. "What is this?" I asked. But the words came out small. "This," he said, gesturing toward the house, "is your gift. Tiffany and I thought you could use a change of scenery. Fresh air. Quiet. It'll be good for you." "Good for me," my voice cracked. "Daniel, this place. This isn't safe. There's nothing here." He sighed, rubbed his forehead like I was being difficult. "Mama, we talked about this. You said the city noise was getting to you. Remember, I never said I wanted to live in the middle of nowhere." He didn't look at me. Tiffany stayed in the car, pretending to check something on her phone. "Daniel, please," I whispered. "What is really going on?" He finally met my eyes. "Tiffany's pregnant. We need the extra space. You'll be happier here. Trust me." The words hit me like a blow. Pregnant. Space. Happier here. I felt my chest tighten as if the air itself had turned solid. "So this is it," I said softly. "You're leaving me here." He winced but didn't answer. He turned, walked back to the car, and said without looking over his shoulder, "Everything's set up. There's food in the kitchen." I wanted to shout, to grab his arm, but my voice died somewhere between my heart and my throat. He climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and for 1 second I thought he might look back. He didn't. The car rolled down the dirt road, kicking up a cloud of dust that swallowed him whole. When the sound of the engine faded, there was nothing. No birds. No wind. Only the slow creak of the porch as I stepped onto it. The boards groaned under my feet. I pushed the door open. It protested with a long, aching squeal. Inside, the air smelled of mildew and old wood. Dust floated in thin rays of light, slipping through cracks in the boards. There was a table, a chair, and a stove with its mouth open like something hungry. I set my bag down, my fingers trembling, and leaned against the wall. I should have cried, but the tears wouldn't come. I felt empty, like a well that had been dry for years. My son, my only child, had just left me here like an unwanted pet. After a while, I stepped outside again. The heat had softened, and a faint wind moved through the weeds. The place looked forgotten by everyone. A village that had lost even the memory of itself. Across the narrow dirt path stood another house. Not as broken, but still weathered by time. Its windows were shut tight, curtains drawn. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of movement behind one of them. But when I blinked, it was gone. I took a few steps toward the fence between our properties. The wood gray and splintered. Beyond it, the grass swayed high and thick. The air was so quiet that my heartbeat sounded like thunder in my chest. Somewhere far off, a dog barked once and went silent. The evening sun dipped low, turning everything gold and red. I sank down on the porch step, my legs weak. The bag Daniel had left sat beside me, small and sad, like a piece of another life. I whispered his name once, then again, but only the wind answered. As the light faded, a sound drifted across the still air. A soft, deliberate tapping, like knuckles against old wood. I froze. It came from the direction of the neighboring house. Steady, almost rhythmic. I stood up, my heart thudding. The sound stopped. I waited, staring into the growing dusk. But nothing moved. For a long time, I stayed there, listening to the silence and the echo of that faint tapping. Then I turned, went inside, and closed the door. The hinges groaned as if they, too, were tired. I leaned my back against it, the darkness wrapping around me like a blanket that wasn't warm. That was the moment I realized my life had changed completely. I had been left behind. But I wasn't gone yet. And somewhere beyond that broken wall, someone else was awake. Morning came gray and heavy, the kind of light that makes everything look tired. I hadn't slept much. Every sound in that house had felt alive through the night. The settling of old wood, the whisper of the wind finding its way through the cracks. I sat up slowly, my back stiff from the floorboards. The air was thick with dust and something damp, like old soil after rain. I opened the door and stepped outside. The world was still, as if holding its breath. In the daylight, the place looked even worse. The roof sagged over me like a question mark, and weeds had swallowed the yard. I could see the faint outline of what might once have been a fence, now rotting and leaning into the earth. Beyond it stretched a narrow dirt path, and across it, another house. That house looked a little sturdier than mine, though its windows were covered with weathered boards. One of the shutters moved slightly, and I thought for a moment someone might be looking out. But it was probably just the wind. I wondered who had lived there, and if anyone still did. I forced myself to move. The first thing I needed was water. Behind the house, hidden under a curtain of wild vines, I found a well with a wooden frame so old it looked ready to collapse. I pulled at the handle, but it stuck. After several tries, I heard the squeal of metal on metal and the creak of a chain lowering into the darkness. When the bucket came back up, it was half full. The water cloudy, but real. I carried it inside like a prize. There was an old tin cup on the counter. I rinsed it, filled it, and drank. The water tasted of rust and stone. But it was cold, and it steadied me. The house was nearly empty. A wooden table leaned against one wall. A chair missing one leg. A small stove black with soot. On the floor lay a torn curtain and a single shoe, small enough to belong to a child. I wondered who had left it there and how long ago. I started cleaning without really thinking about it. I found a broom in the corner. The handle splintered but still usable, and began sweeping. Dust rose in pale clouds, catching the thin light that fell through the cracks. It felt good to have something to do. At some point, I realized how quiet it was. Not just the usual country quiet, but something deeper, emptier. No birds, no cars, no distant hum of life, just the sound of my own breathing. It was the kind of silence that presses against your ears until it becomes its own kind of noise. By late afternoon, I had cleared one room enough to see the floorboards again. I moved my bag to a corner, sat on the chair, and looked around. The place was still broken, but it felt a little less like a tomb. As the light faded, I made myself step outside again. The air had cooled, and a thin mist gathered near the fields. I stood on the porch, watching the colors drain from the sky. Across the path, the other house sat in shadow. A sound reached me, soft but clear. Someone was chopping wood far off. The rhythmic thud echoed faintly through the still air. For the first time all day, the silence didn't feel completely empty. When darkness came, I brought the bucket of water inside and shut the door. I had found a candle stub earlier and lit it. The flame threw long shadows against the walls, turning cracks into deep scars. I wrapped my sweater tighter around me and sat by the stove. I thought of Daniel then, how he used to come home from school with stories about kids who picked on him, how I'd make him cocoa and tell him he was stronger than he thought. I remembered the way he used to hold my hand when we crossed the street. Somewhere along the line, that boy had vanished, replaced by a man I barely recognized. The flame flickered. I told myself not to cry, but the weight of the day pressed down on me. My hands shook. I whispered Paul's name, my late husband, as if saying it might make the room warmer. Then it happened. A faint sound from outside, near the wall behind me. 3 gentle taps, like someone knocking on wood. I froze. The candlelight trembled. The sound came again. Deliberate this time. I stood, heart pounding, and went to the window. The boards outside blocked most of the view, but through a gap I saw a faint light across the path. A lantern swinging slowly. I hesitated, then opened the door just enough to look out. The night smelled of wet grass and smoke. The lantern light came closer until I could make out a figure, tall and broad-shouldered, carrying a bundle of firewood. He stopped near the fence and called out, voice deep but calm, "Evening, ma'am. You must be the new one." I didn't move closer. "Yes," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You should stay inside at night," he said, still polite. "The wind gets mean around here." Then he nodded once, turned, and disappeared toward the house across the path. I stood there for a long moment, the night pressing against my skin, before closing the door again. My pulse was still racing. The voice hadn't sounded threatening, just steady, matter of fact. But there was something about it, something that hinted he knew more than he said. Back inside. I blew out the candle and lay down on the floor. The boards were hard, but I was too tired to care. The darkness settled in, thick and complete. I could still hear faint sounds from outside the creak of wood, the whisper of weeds brushing against the house. And every so often, what might have been a single, distant tap against the wall. I told myself it was just the wind. But deep down, I wasn't sure. When the morning light slipped through the cracks in the walls, I woke to the sound of dripping water from the roof. The air was cool, damp, and smelled faintly of wood smoke from somewhere far off. For a moment, I forgot where I was. Then I remembered everything, and the weight of it settled on me like a stone. I got up slowly, rubbed the stiffness out of my knees, and made myself some weak instant coffee with the last of the bottled water Daniel had left in my bag. It tasted bitter and metallic, but it was something warm in my hands. I stepped outside and sat on the porch. The world around me was still. Mist clung to the trees like ghosts, and the sky was a dull, pale gray. The house across the path stood quiet, its curtains unmoving. Whoever that man was, he hadn't shown himself again. I thought about his warning, about the wind getting mean. Maybe he was right. Maybe the wind wasn't the only thing I needed to worry about out here. I tried not to think about Daniel, but the mind has its own will. Every memory of him came uninvited. I remembered him at 5 years old, running through the backyard with a stick, pretending it was a sword, laughing until he fell over. I remembered his first job after college, when he called to tell me he'd been promoted. And I stayed up half the night baking his favorite pie, even though he didn't come by to get it. I remembered the way he used to hug me without embarrassment, before Tiffany came along and turned every hug into an obligation. After Paul died, Daniel insisted I move in with them. He said he didn't want me to be alone. I believed him. I packed up my condo, brought my books, my husband's photographs, and the old armchair Paul used to read the paper in. But little by little, my things disappeared. Tiffany replaced my curtains, then my dishes, then the framed photos on the wall. My world shrank to one small room at the back of their townhouse, the one that used to be a storage closet. I used to wake up early every morning, careful not to make noise. I'd start coffee for Daniel, make his oatmeal, and prepare Tiffany's herbal tea that always smelled like perfume. I'd sit quietly in the kitchen corner, sipping my own plain tea while they laughed about work, their friends, their plans. Sometimes Tiffany would glance at me and smile, that tight little smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mama, you don't need to worry about the bills," she'd say. "We buy everything together." I thought it was kindness then. Now I see it was control. My Social Security check went straight into our joint account. Every time I asked about it, Daniel would say, "Mama, what do you need money for? You have everything here." Everything. I had a roof, a bed, and the uneasy feeling of being tolerated in my own home. I told myself it was fine, that I was doing what mothers do, sacrificing so their children could have better lives. I thought love meant giving until there was nothing left. The last year before they brought me here, I got sick with pneumonia. I was too weak to get out of bed. Tiffany fussed over me, made soup, brought papers for me to sign. She said they were for the Homeowners Association, some tax documents that needed my signature. I could barely hold the pen, my vision blurry from fever. She guided my hand, told me where to sign. I didn't even question it. Now, sitting on the porch of this broken house, I saw the memory clearly, like a picture that had been out of focus for years. I'd handed over everything without knowing it. A gust of wind lifted my hair, and I pulled my sweater tight. The thought of how easily I'd been fooled made me feel cold inside. I went back into the house and opened the canvas bag Daniel had left. There were a few things inside a folded robe, some towels, a bar of soap, and at the very bottom, wrapped in an old scarf, my small flip phone. Tiffany used to laugh at it, calling it a grandma phone. She once said, "You should get a real phone. Something modern." I told her this one worked fine. She rolled her eyes and said, "It suits you." I pressed the power button. The screen blinked to life. The battery almost full. No service. I walked to the window, held the phone up. Nothing. Then I remembered the small hill behind the house. Maybe higher ground would help. I put on my sneakers, grabbed the phone, and started walking. The path was narrow and overgrown, branches brushing against my arms. My legs ached, but I kept going. The air grew thinner as I climbed. When I reached the top, I could see the valley below. A handful of roofs scattered like forgotten toys. The world looked old from up there. The kind of place time had given up on. 2 tiny bars appeared on the screen. I almost laughed. It felt like a miracle. I opened the contacts and scrolled through. There weren't many numbers saved. Daniel, Tiffany, my doctor, and one more, Harold Bennett. He'd been Paul's friend and our bank manager for years. I pressed call. The phone rang longer than I expected. Then a familiar, steady voice answered. "Evelyn." "Well, it's been a long time." What a surprise. "Hello, Harold," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I need a favor. And it's urgent." "Of course. What's going on?" "I need you to remove all powers of attorney and access from Daniel Carter on my accounts. Every single one." There was a pause. "Are you sure?" "Evelyn, I'm sure. And please, redirect my retirement deposits to my personal savings account. The one from years ago. Can you do that?" Another pause. Softer this time. "Yes, I can. It'll be done today. Are you all right?" I looked down the hill at the house that wasn't a home and said quietly, "I will be. Thank you, Harold." When I ended the call, I stood there for a moment, the wind tugging at my hair. It felt like something inside me had shifted. A small, firm click in my chest. Like a lock turning. I walked back down slowly, careful not to trip on the roots. The house looked smaller from a distance, almost harmless. But I knew better now. It wasn't just a place Daniel had dumped me. It was a starting point. Inside, the light had changed. Golden beams slipped through the cracks, falling across the dusty floor. I sat by the window and watched the dust swirl in the air like tiny ghosts. My hands stopped trembling. That night, I lit a candle and set it on the table. I poured a little water into a pot, warmed it on the stove, and made myself a cup of tea. The first sip burned my tongue, but I didn't care. I wasn't sure what would come next. But for the first time in a long while, I felt something that almost resembled calm. I had lost nearly everything, but there were still pieces of my life I could take back. Outside, the wind rose again, brushing against the boards of the house like fingertips. Somewhere in the darkness, a branch creaked, and a single leaf tapped softly against the window. I sat still, listening, not afraid this time. The quiet wasn't my enemy anymore. It was waiting for me to decide what to do with it. The next morning, the light came through the window, soft and golden, cutting lines across the dusty floor. I sat at the small table, sipping the last of my instant coffee, and thought about what I had done the day before. For the first time in years, I had made a decision for myself. It felt strange, fragile, and powerful all at once. I wanted to hear another human voice, someone I could trust. After breakfast, I climbed the hill again. my phone clutched in my hand. 2 bars of signal. I scrolled through the contacts until I found Marcus Lee, the lawyer who had helped Paul and me settle our estate years ago. He had been kind, patient, the kind of man who explained things slowly without making you feel small. When he answered, his voice was exactly as I remembered. Mrs. Carter. Well, this is a surprise. How are you doing? I hesitated, not sure where to begin. Marcus, I need your help. I think something happened with my property. My home in Richmond. Can you look into it? Of course, he said. Are you still at the same address? No, I said quietly. I'm staying somewhere else for now. I just need to know if the title to the house is still under my name. He paused, the sound of papers rustling on his end. I can check that today. I'll call you back. Is there anything else I should know? My throat tightened. I think my signature was used on something I didn't understand. I'll take care of it, he said. You'll hear from me soon. When I hung up, the wind caught the edge of my sweater and lifted it like a sail. I felt cold despite the sun, but I also felt something like control. Maybe small, maybe late, but mine. Back at the house, I tried to busy myself. I found a broom with a cracked handle and swept until the air turned gray with dust. I dragged a few broken boards to patch the gap in the porch steps. Each task grounded me. Each motion a quiet promise to myself that I wasn't going to fade away here. By late afternoon, I heard movement across the dirt path. I looked up and saw the man from the other house, the one who had warned me about the wind. He was stacking firewood near his porch, his shoulders square, movement steady. The air carried the sharp scent of pine. I hesitated, then called out softly, "Hello." He looked up, squinting in the light. His face was lined, sunworn, maybe early 70s, but strong. Afternoon. Ma'am. Settling in all right. Trying to. I said. I'm Evelyn. He nodded once. Curtis Baker. Been here near 15 years. Not many folks stay long in these parts. His voice was calm, neither friendly nor cold. Just certain. I stepped a little closer to the fence. Do you live here alone? He nodded again. Used to be a sheriff's deputy down in Waynesboro. Retired now. Peace and quiet suit me fine. The title fit him. Solid. Steady. Someone who had seen too much and learned to speak only when it mattered. He glanced at my roof. That chimney of yours looks ready to fall. I can help you patch it if you've got a ladder. I smiled, despite myself. I have a broom. That'll do for now, he said, and grinned. It changed his face, softened it. He came by an hour later with a ladder, hammer, and a bucket of nails that looked older than both of us. Together, we worked until the sun dipped behind the trees. He moved easily, never rushed, and told small stories about the town that used to be here before people left for the city. When we finished, I thanked him. He waved it off. I don't do well sitting still. Before leaving, he looked at me a long moment. You got someone checking on you. My son, I said after a pause. He lives in Richmond. He didn't reply, just gave a slow nod and walked back to his house. That evening, the house felt less empty. The repaired chimney gave the place a faint warmth when I lit a small fire. I sat near it, watching the flames lick the iron grate, thinking about how life can turn in the space of a breath. Just as I was drifting towards sleep, the phone buzzed on the table. Marcus. Mrs. Carter. I checked the records. He said, your house is listed under your name, but there's a mortgage attached from 8 months ago. $400,000. The signature looks like yours. My stomach dropped. That can't be right. I never signed anything like that. Then it must have been forged, he said carefully. We'll start with that. I'll need you to find any paperwork. Bank letters. Anything from that time. We can build a case. I thought of Tiffany, standing by my bed when I was sick. Papers in her hand. My fingers clenched around the phone. Marcus. What happens if they took out loans using my house? If we act quickly, we can stop them from taking more. But you'll need evidence. Do you still have anyone who might have seen them handle your mail or papers? I stared at the flickering fire. Maybe. I said slowly. Maybe I do. When I hung up, the silence in the room felt sharp. I thought of Daniel. His nervous hands on the steering wheel. His eyes fixed ahead while he left me here. I thought of Tiffany, smiling too brightly, saying the words, fresh air and peace. The anger came slow, quiet, and steady, like the first crack of ice before it breaks. A knock came at the door. I startled, then opened it to find Curtis holding a small lantern. Thought you might want this, he said. That old place looks dark from across the way. Thank you, I said softly. He studied my face. You look like someone with a lot on her mind. Just tired, I said. He nodded, then added, if you ever need anything, Evelyn. I'm right over there. I don't sleep much these days. After he left, I stood in the doorway, holding the lantern. The flame swayed gently, casting circles of gold on the porch. Somewhere beyond the fence, a whip-poor-will called into the night. The air smelled faintly of smoke and pine. Inside, I set the lantern on the table and sat down. The phone lay beside it, screen dark. But the truth it had revealed burned bright in my chest. Tiffany had stolen more than money. She had taken my trust and my home. And Daniel had let her. But I wasn't helpless anymore. There were still things I could do. I had people who believed me. Even if only a few. Marcus, Harold, and maybe, now, Curtis. I leaned back in the chair, listening to the fire pop and settle. The light from the lantern reached only halfway across the room, leaving the far corners in shadow. But that was all right. I didn't need to see everything yet. The night outside deepened, quiet, except for the rustle of trees. I closed my eyes and let the sound fill the space where fear had been. I wasn't ready to call it hope. Not yet. But it was something close. The morning came heavy with fog that rolled in from the trees, swallowing the edges of the fields. I stood on the porch, clutching the mug of weak coffee I had made from what was left in the tin. The air was damp and smelled faintly of rain. Everything felt suspended in that thick grayness. Quiet but expectant, as if the world was holding its breath. The night before had changed something inside me. Marcus's call had cracked the final piece of denial I'd been clinging to. There was no misunderstanding. Daniel and Tiffany had used me. And now it was clear they had gone as far as forging my name. My chest felt hollow and cold. But it wasn't grief anymore. It was resolve. I needed to protect what was left of my life before they could bury me completely. I spent the early hours searching through my bag again, hoping for anything useful. Near the bottom, I found a folded envelope from the bank. It was addressed to Daniel but with my name listed underneath. I had never opened it. The paper inside was a printed statement for the joint account. My pension payments had gone straight there, but the withdrawals were always made by him. Large ones, too. Thousands at a time. I held the paper for a long while, staring at the numbers as the fog began to lift outside. I climbed the hill again once the signal bars appeared on the phone. My fingers were trembling slightly. Not from fear, but from the effort to stay calm. Marcus answered quickly. I found something, I said, reading out the numbers. He listened. typing in the background. That helps, he said. We'll add those records to the complaint. I've already filed the initial fraud report with the county attorney's office. It felt strange hearing those words. Fraud report. Attached to my own son. For a second, I almost couldn't breathe. Marcus, I whispered. What happens now? He spoke carefully. The bank will freeze access to all connected accounts until the investigation is complete. They can't use your funds anymore. That alone will shake them. Good, I said quietly. Let them feel it. By the time I got back to the house, the fog had burned off. The sun came through clean and bright, but it made the place look even lonelier. I stood in the yard, staring at the broken fence and the patch of dirt that might once have been a garden. Curtis's words from yesterday echoed in my mind. People don't stay long here. I wasn't going anywhere. I found an old shovel leaning against the shed and started digging near the porch. The ground was hard, full of roots, but the motion steadied me. Sweat gathered on my back as I worked, the air smelling of damp soil and pine needles. For the first time since I arrived, I felt my body waking up. I was so focused that I didn't hear the footsteps until Curtis spoke behind me. You're working that ground like it owes you money, he said, a faint smile in his voice. I turned, wiping my forehead with my sleeve. Maybe it does. He chuckled softly. What are you planting? I don't know yet, I said. Maybe something that lasts. He nodded slowly. Then his expression shifted, more serious. I saw a car down the road earlier. New. Shiny. Too fancy for this place. Didn't stop. But it slowed when it passed your house. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Did you see who it was? He shook his head. Tinted windows. Just thought you'd want to know. I thanked him, trying to keep my face steady. When he left, I stood there for a while, the shovel still in my hand. I couldn't prove it, but I knew it had to be them. Daniel or Tiffany checking to see if I was still alive out here. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window, watching the road through the slats of the boards. The moon was full and pale, lighting the fields in a strange, washed-out glow. Every sound made my heart jump a little. A distant howl, the crack of a branch, the wind shifting through the grass. Sometime near midnight, my phone buzzed on the table. The screen glowed in the dark. Daniel. For a moment, I couldn't bring myself to answer. Then I did. Mama, he said, his voice too calm. What's going on? Tiffany's card didn't work at the store. The bank said there's an issue with your account. Did you do something? I said nothing. He said, a practiced sound of frustration. You know, this isn't good for anyone. We can talk about this like adults. I could almost hear Tiffany whispering near him, feeding him lines. I finally spoke, my voice quiet but firm. You'll have to manage on your own. Daniel. There was a pause, then a sharp laugh. Manage on our own, Mama. What's gotten into you? You think you can just cut us off? You wouldn't even have those accounts if it weren't for me. My hand trembled slightly, but I didn't let him hear it. I don't think you understand what you've done, I said. He exhaled sharply, then lowered his tone. Look, I know you're upset. Tiffany said maybe we didn't handle things the right way. But we're family. We just wanted what's best for everyone. You wanted what's best for you, I said. Another pause. His voice rose. So you're punishing us, is that it? I ended the call without replying. My hand was shaking. But it wasn't fear anymore. It was something colder, harder. The silence after the click was almost peaceful. I put the phone down, turned off the light, and sat in the dark. The faint glow of the moon came through the cracks, spilling across the table. They were afraid now. That much was clear. And fear would make them desperate. The next morning, Curtis came by again, carrying a basket with fresh eggs and a jar of honey. Figured you could use something decent to eat, he said. I smiled at him, though my thoughts were still heavy. Thank you, Curtis. That's kind of you. He looked at me closely, eyes sharp behind the calm. You heard from whoever dropped you here. I hesitated, then nodded. My son called. His jaw tightened slightly. That kind of trouble doesn't stop easy. I know, I said, but I'm done being quiet about it. He gave a slow, approving nod. If you ever need a witness for anything, someone who saw what happened when you arrived, I'm your man. I didn't realize until that moment how much I needed to hear that. A witness. Someone who believed me. After he left, I sat at the table again, staring at the folded bank statement. Outside, the air was thick with the smell of rain. I knew they would come soon. Desperation has its own scent, and I could feel it in the wind. When the first drops began to fall, I opened the door and stepped onto the porch. The rain came down steady and cold, washing the dust off the boards. It felt almost like a cleansing. I whispered quietly to the empty yard. A promise more to myself than to anyone else. This time, they won't win. By the next day, the rain had stopped, leaving the air cool and sharp. The yard glistened under a pale morning sun. Every blade of grass tipped with water. I sat on the porch steps with a blanket over my shoulders. The smell of wet earth clinging to everything. The quiet after the storm felt heavier than usual. The kind of quiet that carries warning. I spent the morning cleaning. I scrubbed the table, swept out the corners, and opened a few windows to let the air move. The damp wood sighed as if waking from a long sleep. Around noon, I heated some of the eggs Curtis had brought and ate them with a slice of stale bread. The simple meal reminded me of my grandmother's kitchen back in Roanoke. The way she used to hum while frying potatoes. That memory hurt a little. Soft but deep. By afternoon, the sound of an approaching engine broke the stillness. I froze. The car rolled to a stop on the dirt road. Just out of view. My heart climbed to my throat. I moved to the window and peered through the crack between the boards. A silver sedan. Daniel's car. For a moment, I couldn't move. Then instinct took over. I turned off the stove, pulled the curtain tighter, and waited. The car door slammed. Footsteps crunched on gravel. A knock rattled the door. Mama. Open up. It's me. I didn't answer. The knocking grew louder. I know you're in there. Tiffany's voice, this time. Sharp and impatient. I stepped closer to the door, but didn't open it. What do you want? We just want to talk, Daniel said. His voice sounded tight, rushed. You've made a mistake. I stayed silent. Tiffany cut in, her tone sweet but trembling. We're worried about you. People said you've been acting strange. I almost laughed. Acting strange. They were the ones who left me in this ruin. And now they wanted to play the part of the concerned family. You need to leave, I said. There's nothing to talk about. There was a pause. Then Daniel's voice turned pleading. Mama? Please. We can fix this. The bank froze our accounts. And Tiffany can't even buy groceries. We just need you to call your lawyer and straighten things out. I took a slow breath. My hand steady on the doorknob. I already did straighten things out, I said. Silence. Then Tiffany hissed something I couldn't catch. Daniel tried again, his tone desperate. Mama. You're letting strangers get between us. You've always trusted me. I did, I said softly. That was my mistake. The quiet stretched until finally I heard the crunch of gravel again. The car door slammed twice. The engine roared to life. and they were gone. I didn't move until the sound faded completely. That evening, Curtis stopped by. He noticed my face before I said a word. Trouble came by, didn't it? I nodded. He set down a bag of firewood beside the porch and crossed his arms. You want to tell me what kind? My son and his wife, I said. They're the reason I'm here. He didn't look surprised. People do anything when money's involved, he said quietly. You think they'll come back? I don't think. I know. He gave a slow nod, his jaw tightening. Then I'll keep an eye out. When he left, I felt both safer and sadder. I hadn't asked for help, but the offer made something in me unclench a little. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window again, the lantern low, watching the road. Every sound made my pulse jump. Around midnight, I saw headlights sweep across the far edge of the field, too slow to be passing through. They lingered for a moment, then disappeared. I waited another hour before finally lying down. The next morning I woke to the phone buzzing on the table. I reached for it quickly. It was Marcus. Mrs. Carter. Good morning. I wanted to update you, he said. The bank confirmed your son attempted to withdraw additional funds yesterday, but was denied. He also showed up at the branch making a scene. The security footage matches the timeline you gave. I closed my eyes. So it's official now. Yes. And the fraud division is moving fast. They've frozen everything under his name until the investigation is finished. Thank you, I said. You've done more than I hoped. He hesitated, then added, be careful. If he's desperate, he might not stop at money. After we hung up, I stood at the window, watching a thin layer of fog lift off the ground. Marcus was right. Desperation changes people. And Daniel wasn't just desperate, he was cornered. I spent the day keeping busy, scrubbing the floors, washing the windows, anything to stay moving. By afternoon, the house looked brighter, almost clean. The sense of control, however small, steadied me. Curtis came by near sunset, carrying a jar of stew and 2 spoons. Figured you might not have eaten, he said. I smiled and invited him to sit. We ate in quiet companionship, the stew warm and rich. He talked about his late wife, how she used to bake peach cobbler every Sunday. His voice softened when he spoke of her. And for a while the sadness in the room felt almost peaceful. Before he left, he said, You're tougher than you look, Evelyn, but don't confuse strength with solitude. After he was gone, I sat on the porch watching the sky darken. The air smelled faintly of smoke and pine. For a long time, I just listened to the crickets and the low hum of the woods. Then, somewhere down the road, I heard the sound of a car again. It was faint, almost cautious. Then it stopped. I stood, heart pounding. The headlights cut briefly through the trees, then vanished. I stayed on the porch, motionless, until the night swallowed the sound. I knew this wasn't over. By dawn, the fog had settled again, thick enough that the trees beyond the fence looked like ghosts. I had not slept at all. Every creak of the house had kept me awake. Every whisper of wind through the boards made me think of that car waiting somewhere down the road. I sat at the table with the lantern burning low, the faint smell of oil mixing with the damp air, and waited for the light to come. When morning finally broke, I decided I couldn't stay inside any longer. I needed to feel the ground, to move. I stepped outside and followed the narrow path that led to the well, the one Curtis had helped repair days earlier. The air was cold enough to bite. I pulled my jacket tighter and filled the bucket, the sound of water echoing deep and hollow. It felt grounding, like proof that the world was still solid. Curtis appeared just as I was setting the bucket down. He walked toward me, his steps steady, hands tucked in his coat pockets. "You look like you didn't sleep," he said. "I didn't," I admitted. "They were out there last night. I heard the car again." He frowned, glancing toward the road. "You sure?" I nodded. The sound stopped near the bend. They didn't come up the drive. "But they were watching," he said, rubbing his jaw. "I could talk to someone at the sheriff's office. Old friends still there. It might scare them off if a patrol comes by." I thought for a moment, then shook my head. "Not yet. I don't want this turning into a show. They'd just twist it. Say I'm confused or paranoid." Curtis studied me for a long moment before nodding slowly. "All right. But you promise you'll call me if they show up again?" "I will," I said, meaning it. We carried the bucket back together. And when he left, he turned once on the path and said quietly, "You're not alone out here. Evelyn, remember that." After he was gone, I sat on the porch, staring at the road. The wind moved through the trees, and the first red leaves of October drifted across the yard. For a brief second, the scene looked almost peaceful. But peace is a fragile thing. Late that afternoon, my phone rang. Marcus again. His tone was brisk but gentle. "Mrs. Carter, we have progress. The district attorney's office is moving forward with an official investigation into the mortgage. I'll need you to come into town next week to give a statement." "I'll be there," I said. He hesitated. "I should warn you. Your son and his wife have already hired counsel. They're claiming you're not of sound mind." The words hit like ice water. Not of sound mind. They were going to try to paint me as unstable. The very thing Tiffany had hinted at before. Marcus kept talking, explaining procedures. But I barely heard him. I thanked him and hung up, staring at the dark screen in my palm. The betrayal had found a new depth. It wasn't enough that they'd taken my home and money. Now they wanted to steal my sanity too. I spent the evening pacing the small room. My thoughts ran wild. I imagined them sitting in their bright kitchen, rehearsing their lines for court. Tiffany, with her soft, trembling voice. Daniel, with that tight, performative sadness. My chest tightened until I had to sit down. The knock came just after sundown. 3 slow, deliberate raps on the door. I froze. "It's me," came a low voice. "Curtis." Relief swept through me. I opened the door. He stood holding a folded newspaper and a worried look. "Thought you should see this," he said. The headline jumped out in bold black letters. "Local couple alleges elderly mother defrauded them." Beneath it was a picture of Daniel and Tiffany, posed just so, his hand protectively on her shoulder, her eyes downcast like a martyr. My stomach turned. The article quoted Tiffany saying she feared for my health, that I'd become erratic, that I'd cut them off financially without reason. It painted them as victims, and me as a confused, bitter old woman. I couldn't speak. Curtis watched me quietly, his expression hardening. "That's low," he said. "Lower than I thought they'd go." I folded the paper and set it aside. "They're preparing for war," I said softly. "Then you give them one," he replied. The conviction in his voice steadied me. I nodded slowly. I already started. After he left, I sat by the fire, staring into the flames. The light flickered across the walls, making the shadows dance. My anger had cooled into something sharper, cleaner. I wasn't going to react blindly anymore. I was going to make sure the truth came out in a way they couldn't twist. The next few days passed in a blur of small preparations. Marcus sent documents for me to review, and I read them carefully by lamplight, making notes in the margins. Curtis helped me gather proof. copies of old bank records, letters, and even a witness statement about the day I was dropped off here. Each piece of paper felt like a brick in the wall I was building between myself and them. A wall of truth. One night, while I was sorting the papers, the phone buzzed again. Unknown number. My chest tightened. But I answered. "Mama." Danielle's voice came, low and shaky. "We saw the article. It wasn't supposed to go that far. Tiffany's crying. You have to stop this." I stayed silent. He tried again. "You're ruining us. Do you understand that? They could take everything." I finally spoke. My tone even. "I didn't ruin you. Daniel, you did that yourself." He was breathing hard. "Mama, please. We can fix this. I'll drive up there right now. We can talk in person." "Don't," I said quietly. "Don't come here again." He said something else, but I didn't listen. I ended the call and set the phone face down. My hands were steady. For the first time, I felt no guilt. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through the trees. The sound wasn't haunting anymore. It felt like applause. When I finally lay down, exhaustion pulled me under fast. I dreamed of sunlight breaking through the cracks in the walls, warm and blinding. And somewhere in that light, Paul's voice saying softly, "Keep going." I woke with tears on my cheeks. But my heart felt lighter. Tomorrow, I told myself, the fight would begin in earnest. The morning of the hearing came cold and brittle. The kind of day when the air stings your skin before you even open the door. I dressed carefully, choosing the one good coat I still had. Gray wool with worn cuffs, but a steady dignity to it. Marcus had sent a car to pick me up, but I insisted on driving with Curtis. Somehow I needed someone beside me who wasn't part of the legal world. Someone real. He arrived right on time. His truck clean, smelling faintly of tobacco and pine. "You ready?" he asked quietly. "As I'll ever be," I said. The courthouse in Staunton sat on a small hill overlooking the square. Its old brick facade solid against the bright winter sky. People hurried up the steps, collars turned up against the wind. I hadn't been in a courtroom since Paul and I bought our house decades ago. That memory felt like another life. Marcus met us at the door. Crisp suit, papers in hand. He greeted me with a reassuring nod. "Remember, Mrs. Carter, just tell the truth plainly. Let them talk themselves into the hole they've already dug." We walked into the hearing room. Daniel and Tiffany were already there. Seeing them again hit me like a physical blow. Danielle looked pale, older than I remembered, the skin tight around his jaw. Tiffany sat next to him, dressed in muted tones, a handkerchief clutched dramatically in one hand. When her eyes met mine, she gave a tiny, pitying smile that made my stomach twist. The judge was an older woman with sharp eyes and a calm, even tone. She reviewed the documents Marcus had submitted, proof of my sole ownership. Medical records showing my illness. The notarized signature that clearly wasn't mine. Each paper hit the table like a quiet drumbeat of truth. Then it was their turn. Their lawyer, a slick man in a blue suit, spoke of misunderstanding and miscommunication. He described me as elderly and easily confused. Words that burned through me like acid. Tiffany dabbed her eyes at the right moments, Daniel's hand resting on hers like a trained gesture. When it was time for me to speak, I rose slowly, every joint protesting. But my voice came steady. I told them how I'd been sick, how Tiffany had brought me papers while I lay in bed barely conscious, how Daniel had left me in that broken house without explanation. My words were simple, factual, but every sentence felt like reclaiming another piece of myself. The lawyer tried to interrupt once, But the judge raised her hand. Let her finish. When I sat down, the room was silent. Tiffany's tears had stopped. Daniel wouldn't look at me. The hearing ended with the judge ordering a full forensic review of the mortgage documents and keeping the freeze on their accounts. Marcus leaned over and whispered, "That's the beginning of the end for them." Outside, the air felt sharper but lighter somehow. Curtis walked beside me, saying nothing until we reached the truck. "You did good in there," he said finally. "Real good." I exhaled slowly, the cold air cutting into my lungs. Maybe. But it's not over yet. The days that followed were strange. News spread faster than I expected. The local paper that had once printed their lies now ran a correction, though small and buried deep in the middle pages. People started looking at Daniel differently. His company suspended him, pending investigation. Tiffany's friends, the ones who used to parade her at charity luncheons, stopped calling. Marcus called every other day with updates. The bank confirmed the forgery. Their access remained locked, and criminal charges were being prepared. He told me to expect them to reach out again. People like that never surrender quietly. He was right. 3 nights later, I woke to a noise outside. It was soft, the crunch of gravel under hesitant steps. I sat up, every sense on alert. Through the slats of the boarded window, I saw faint movement near the porch. I grabbed the flashlight and crept to the door. When I opened it, a gust of cold air rushed in. There, standing in the moonlight, was Daniel, alone. He looked smaller than I remembered, thinner, like the anger had drained him dry. His voice cracked when he spoke. "Mama, please, I just want to talk." I didn't answer. He took a step forward, hands raised slightly. "Tiffany left me," he said. "She took what little we had left and disappeared. The bank, my job, everything's gone. I have nowhere else to go." For a long moment, all I could hear was the wind through the trees. I thought of the little boy who once built sandcastles beside me at the beach, who fell asleep in my lap after thunderstorms. Then I thought of the man who had left me here to rot. "You made your choice," I said softly. He shook his head. "I didn't know she'd do this. I didn't know she'd take it that far." A bitter laugh rose in my throat. "You signed the papers. Daniel, you watched me get sick and still put the pen in my hand." He dropped his gaze, shoulders slumping. "I thought I could fix it." "You can't fix betrayal," I said. "You live with it. Or you learn from it." He took another step, desperation edging his voice. "Please, Mama, I just need a place to stay for a while. I'll find work. I'll make it right." Before I could speak, a voice came from behind me. "I think it's time you head back, son." Curtis stood on the porch, calm and solid, the shotgun in his hands, angled low but unmistakable. His presence filled the space like stone. Daniel froze. For a second, I saw his old pride flare. But then it died out. He looked at me one last time, eyes empty, and turned away. We watched him walk down the road until the darkness swallowed him. Curtis lowered the gun and set it by the door. "You all right?" he asked. I nodded slowly. "He won't be back." He studied me for a long moment, then said, "Maybe not. But if he does, he'll find out some people can't be broken twice." I looked out at the road, the faint tire tracks already fading under the wind. I felt no triumph, only the strange, steady peace of knowing the worst was behind me. When I went back inside, I sat by the fire until dawn. The house no longer felt haunted. It felt lived in, claimed. The storm that had followed me for so long was finally passing. And in its quiet wake, I could almost hear something new beginning. The weeks that followed felt like a slow thaw after a long winter. The days grew brighter, the air lighter, and each sunrise brought the sound of birds returning to the woods. I spent most mornings outside, working in the small patch of earth near the porch. Curtis had helped me clear the soil. And now, tiny green shoots had started pushing through, life finding its way, even in forgotten places. Marcus called every few days, his updates becoming shorter each time. The investigation had reached its end. The bank confirmed everything. The forged signature, the false witness statements, the misuse of my accounts. Charges were filed against Daniel and Tiffany, both facing fraud and forgery. They would have their day in court soon. But for me, the real trial had already ended. One afternoon, while I was tending the garden, Curtis came by carrying 2 mugs of lemonade. "You look different," he said, handing me one. "How so?" I asked. "Like you finally started breathing again." I smiled faintly. "Maybe I have." He sat on the porch steps beside me, looking out toward the road. Heard from him again. Not a word. Marcus said he's still in the county, waiting for his hearing. Tiffany's gone. No one knows where. Curtis nodded. Probably best that way. We sat in silence, the hum of cicadas filling the air. I hadn't realized until that moment how peaceful silence could be when it wasn't born of fear. Later that week, I went into town for the first time since everything had begun. The drive felt strange. The roads both familiar and foreign. The courthouse, the diner, the grocery store. All looked smaller somehow. People stared when I walked in, whispers following like a low tide. I wasn't the crazy old woman from the article anymore. Now I was something else. Something harder to name. At the counter, the waitress, a young girl with freckles, smiled shyly. "I saw you in the paper," she said softly. "Good for you." "Ma'am." Took a lot of guts. Her words warmed me more than the coffee. Maybe that was all I'd ever wanted. To be seen for what I was instead of what they said I was. When I returned home that evening, the sun was low, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. Curtis was on his porch, whittling a piece of wood, his dog dozing at his feet. I waved, and he lifted his hand in reply. That night, I lit a small fire and pulled out the photo album I had managed to save. The pictures had yellowed, but the faces still looked back at me clearly. Paul, smiling as he held baby Daniel. Our first Christmas together in the old house. I traced their outlines with my fingers, feeling the ghosts of old warmth and old hurt. I didn't cry. The tears had come and gone long ago. What I felt now was quieter. A kind of acceptance that didn't erase the pain, but made space for it. A week later, Marcus called again. His voice was light for the first time. "Mrs. Carter, it's over. The court ruled in your favor. Full restitution. The mortgage voided. Your property cleared of all encumbrances. They've lost everything they tried to take from you." I sat down, my knees weak. "Thank you, Marcus. I don't know how to repay you. Just keep living," he said. "That'll be enough." When the call ended, I went outside and stood on the porch. The air smelled of rain and wildflowers. The trees swayed gently in the breeze. I closed my eyes and let the quiet soak in. That evening, Curtis came by with a small wooden box. "I made this for you," he said, handing it over. Inside was a hand-carved key holder. Simple, but beautiful. Shaped like a house with 2 tiny windows. "It's perfect," I said softly. He nodded toward the road. "You thinking about going back to the city, now that all's cleared up?" I looked out at the horizon, the last light of day stretching over the fields. "No," I said after a long moment. "I think I'll stay right here." He smiled. "Good. The neighborhood could use a little life again." After he left, I hung the key holder by the door. The single key that used to open my old condo now rested in it, a symbol of something gone but finally at peace. In the weeks that followed, I found new rhythms. I planted herbs by the window, painted the shutters blue, and fixed the broken fence. Curtis helped me mend the roof one last time. And on quiet evenings we sat together, sharing tea and stories about the past. Sometimes I still thought of Daniel. I wondered if he ever looked back at what he had done, if he felt regret or only anger. But those thoughts didn't sting the way they used to. I had learned that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. It meant letting go of the weight that kept me chained to their cruelty. As spring gave way to summer, the garden bloomed in wild colors. The peonies were the first to open, bright and full like small suns. I spent mornings tending them, hands in the dirt, the warmth of the sun on my back. One evening, as the light faded and the fireflies began to rise, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not happiness exactly, but peace. The kind that comes after surviving a storm and realizing the ground beneath you is still solid. The house behind me creaked softly in the breeze, its old bones settling into their new life. I leaned back in the chair and watched the sky darken, the stars flickering to life, one by one. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't waiting for the next blow or the next betrayal. I was simply here, alive, free, and unbroken. The sound of crickets filled the evening air, soft and rhythmic like a heartbeat. I sat on the porch, a cup of tea warming my hands, the scent of lemon balm and mint rising with the steam. The stars had just started to show, faint glimmers scattered across the darkening sky. My garden was quiet except for the whisper of the wind through the leaves. Life had become simple again, the kind of quiet that didn't ache anymore. Weeks had passed since the court's decision. The house that had once been my prison now felt like a promise. Every morning I woke up before sunrise, fed the stray cat that had decided to adopt me, and worked in the garden until the sun climbed high. Curtis still came by most afternoons, sometimes with groceries, sometimes just to sit. We rarely talked about the past now. Some wounds don't need words, only presence. One afternoon, he brought me a newspaper. The article was buried deep inside. Just a few short paragraphs. Daniel Carter sentenced to 3 years in state prison for fraud. Tiffany Carter still at large. I read it once, then folded it neatly and placed it under the flower pot on the porch table. It wasn't satisfaction I felt. It was finality. Later that evening, I walked to the hill behind the house. From there, I could see the valley spread wide and green, the town a blur of lights in the distance. The air smelled of pine and wet grass. For the first time in years, I let myself think of Paul without the heaviness of regret. I could almost hear him say what he always did when life tested us. "You're tougher than you think, Evie. You always have been." I smiled to the wind and whispered, "You were right." When I came back down, Curtis was sitting on the porch steps with 2 cups of tea. He handed me one and nodded toward the horizon. "You did it," he said. "You got your life back." I looked at the house, at the faint light spilling through the window, at the small flowers swaying in the evening breeze. "I didn't just get it back," I said quietly. "I started it over." We sat in silence after that, the kind that doesn't need filling. The moon climbed higher, turning the world silver. Somewhere nearby an owl called, slow and steady. The next morning I woke early, the sunlight slanting through the clean glass panes. I brewed coffee and took it outside. The cat stretched on the porch rail, purring softly. Across the road, Curtis was already splitting firewood. His movements, sure and steady. He caught my eye and waved. I waved back, feeling a warmth that went deeper than the sun. Around noon, I opened a box I hadn't touched since the day I moved here. Inside were the few things I had brought from my old life, Paul's armchair photo. A small embroidered pillow I made when Daniel was a child. And a silver locket. I opened it, seeing the picture inside. The three of us, smiling by the ocean. For a long time, I stared at it, my heart full but calm. Then I closed it gently and set it on the windowsill. Some memories are meant to be part of the view, not the weight you carry. Curtis came by later with news that made me laugh for the first time in months. The town council had approved funding to restore the abandoned houses in the area. He said mine would be the first they'd start with, thanks to the improvements I'd already made. Guess you started something here, he said with a grin. I suppose I did, I replied. As the weeks turned into months, the house truly became mine. I painted the porch a soft cream color, replaced the old shingles, and planted roses by the fence. Neighbors began moving back into the empty houses nearby. Children's laughter returned to the dirt road. The town that had once been a graveyard was breathing again. One Sunday, Curtis came over with a surprise. A small wooden sign he had carved himself. It read, Reed's Place, established 2024. He hung it by the porch while I stood watching, smiling so hard it hurt. That night we celebrated with stew, homemade bread, and a bottle of wine he'd been saving. We toasted to new beginnings, to freedom, to peace. I didn't realize until that moment that peace could feel this alive. Before bed, I stepped outside one last time. The night was warm, and the fireflies blinked lazily over the garden. I breathed in the scent of the earth, of the flowers, of the promise of another day. I wasn't the woman who had been abandoned anymore. I wasn't even the woman who fought to reclaim what was hers. I was someone new, someone stronger, standing on her own ground. Sometimes I think about the strange path that led me here. How betrayal, heartbreak, and loss can strip a person bare until all that's left is truth. And how in that raw emptiness, you can finally see who you really are. I took one last sip of tea and smiled to the quiet yard around me. This was my life now, and it was enough. If you stayed with me through this story, thank you. Maybe you saw a piece of your own strength in it, or a reminder that it's never too late to start over. If you did, let me know in the comments. Tell me where you're listening from, and what part spoke to you most. Your stories matter too, and I'd love to hear them. Until next time, take care of yourself. And remember, peace isn't something you find, it's something you build.